everyone, and welcome to the Double Blind Magic Hour, where we cover what's going on in the world of psychedelics, from insider baseball drama within the rapidly unfolding psychedelic movement to the latest news on research, politics, and beyond. I'm Shelby Hartman, co-founder of Double Blind, a print magazine covering psychedelics, and today we're joined by journalist Reilly Capps. He's written on drugs for The Washington Post and Rooster Magazine, among many others. He's also reported several robust stories for Double Blind, mostly centered around psychedelic policy. Hey, Reilly.
Hi, Shelby. Really nice to see you.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We're stoked to have Fungi as the official sponsor of the Double Blind Magic Hour. Fungi makes psychedelic alternative chocolates and fruit chews activated with kanna. And if you haven't heard of or explored kanna yet, I highly recommend it. It's a beautiful plant from South Africa that is growing in popularity. It is completely legal, and it's a very heart-opening experience. Some people use it as an alternative to alcohol. People also use it in meditation. There's a lot of uses for kanna. One of the amazing things about fungi is that they not only include kanna, but they also include other ingredients that are intended for sort of gentle stimulation. They're intended for having a good time. They can also be used as aphrodisiacs. They include a combination of kanna and also functional mushrooms in their products. And from my personal experience, I really enjoyed taking these. I had a friend over the other day. We took some fungi chocolates. We did some yoga in my backyard. And it was just like that gentle opening and relaxation that we were wanting as we wrapped our days. So whether you're going to a festival, whether you are going on a mushroom trip, or you're just looking to have a good time with yourself at home in your backyard, I recommend checking out Fungi. Podcast listeners can get 25% off their first order. Just use code DoubleBlindPod at fungi, FUNGUY.com. This episode is brought to you by our sponsor, Psyched Wellness. Psyched Wellness is on a mission to bring you the healing, restorative magic of Amanita muscaria mushrooms with their product, Calm. Calm is a unique, legal Amanita muscaria extract available for sale in the United States. It's been formulated by wellness professionals to help you rest, relax, and keep stress at bay, all without the high. You can get some Calm in your life now and save 10% with the code DOUBLEBLIND at psyched-wellness.com. That's PSYCHED-wellness.com. So what are you waiting for? Drift into dreamland with Calm. Your mind and body will thank you. So I always like to start these episodes by asking our correspondents how they got to be where they are, because being a journalist is unique. Being someone who works in psychedelics is unique. Being a journalist that writes about psychedelics is very unique. Like, there's not that many of us. So how did you get to be where you are?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that this job is one of the few where I had to take a drug test to make sure I was doing enough drugs. And, it's really not that different from the other things I've done. I mean, I've been a sports writer and an arts writer, and those are just kind of confining your reporting to something specific. And so you know a lot about sports or arts, and in this case, I just know a lot about psychedelics. And the way I got into it was the same way that everybody gets into it, which was 15 years ago. I drank a cup of ayahuasca, and I said, holy moly, what is that? Like, I have to make this part of my life. And at the time, I was hanging out with Shipibo people and also Western people that used it for their depression. And so it was just the question of like, why isn't this being reported on? Why do we have reporters on sports and arts, but not this thing that is so amazing, just as amazing as a volcano erupting or seeing the Grand Canyon? Like, we just need people paying attention. And now, thankfully, we do.
So ayahuasca was your first psychedelic experience?
I mean, I had done some psychedelics in college, but just very like having fun at a campsite kind of thing, and didn't think too much of it. But then once I got into an ayahuasca circle, where it was with more intention and where it had changed so many people's lives, it had changed cultures. That's when I really started to pay attention. And also when it started to change me, because like so many other people, it did change the way I see the world, see myself, see my friends, see nature. So that was when I realized the power of these things. Something that had been used in Shipibo culture for 12-year-olds and their stomach aches, and is now being used by 45-year-olds in the West to treat their depression. That's an amazing, amazing substance. So now I report
Yeah.
about all these other medicines are being used around me here in Colorado. And so I'm paying attention to a lot more now.
Yeah, that is wild to have kind of your first really profound experience be ayahuasca. It was sort of something similar, but not quite the same with me, where I had had many profound experiences on psychedelics. The first time that I tripped was when I was 18. I was in college, I did mushrooms, but I didn't try ayahuasca until I was 25. And even though I'd had so many other psychedelic experiences, I think a lot of people have this experience of you do ayahuasca and it's just another level of sort of touching these other dimensions, touching the mysticism, touching the potential for profundity. Like you can't fully understand what a psychedelic is capable of. I don't want to say that because I don't want to diminish other people's experiences, but I want to say I didn't fully understand what a psychedelic was capable of until I drank ayahuasca.
Yeah, and I think it's specific to ayahuasca in some ways, but it's also just a generalized thing when you take these things in a big dose in something that really makes you feel them with people who really know how to navigate the realm. I think that can happen on mushrooms and MDMA and a lot of things, but ayahuasca already has this structure around it where
Mm,
people know what to do with it. And I think we're getting to the point where there's going to be mushroom ceremonies, where there are mushroom ceremonies, where people do it in the same big way. And it is
right.
like, to use the rafting analogy, it's the difference between like rafting down a local, stream is like taking some mushrooms with your friend, but then like really dropping in on a big dose with someone who knows what they're doing is really like doing like a class 5 in the middle of the Grand Canyon, where you just look around, you say, oh my gosh, this world is bigger than I thought it was.
I love that this world is bigger than I thought it was because that's exactly the feeling, right? Like I just didn't know how deep and how far and how wide this could be. And I also really appreciate you bringing up the importance of the container, as we call it in the psychedelic space, the sort of environment in which you are having the psychedelic experience and who is holding that space. Because specifically, you're referencing the Shipibo. The Shipibo, for folks who don't know, are one of the two largest groups in the Amazon. And there are many, many groups. I want to say dozens, maybe I think more than 100 groups that serve ayahuasca in the Amazon. But the Shipibo are the main indigenous community that have really opened themselves up to foreigners coming in and drinking ayahuasca with them. So if you go to like Peru or Colombia, chances are you're probably going to be sitting with someone who's Shipibo. And I think it's interesting to note that the Shipibo traditionally, when they were trying to heal someone with ayahuasca, they were not giving ayahuasca to the person that was looking to be healed. The maestro or the maestra was drinking the ayahuasca and then singing these songs called Icaro, which are gifted to them by the plants. And the Icaro, the songs themselves are what are supposed to sort of surgically be going into a person and healing them. And so this really speaks to the sophistication of this sort of cultural and spiritual technology, that it's not as simple, at least in the Shipibo sort of cosmology, as you drink ayahuasca and you're going to get better. Who is holding that space for you and how they're holding that space can make all the difference in the outcome. And I can speak to that personally because when I was 25, yes, I had a very profound ayahuasca experience, but I was sitting with a quote unquote Westerner who hadn't trained extensively in the Amazon. And when I went to outside Iquitos and I sat with 5 Shipibo maestras who were singing Icaro to me in a maloca in the jungle, I will tell you it was completely different experience. So it's not just about the medicine or the drug, depending on the word you'd like to use.
Yeah, totally. It's a whole technology for them. And they use it like we use, they have like a pharmacopoeia of them because it's not just ayahuasca either. They mix it with all of these other plants that they know what they do and they have specific uses for each one. And they use it for a ton of different things. Like I said, my Shipibo friend who grew up in the Amazon, they used it when she was 12 years old for a stomach ache. And they gave her a little bit, not enough to have a full blown trip, but that was the use there. They also use it on babies, if I'm understanding it right, as a kind of baptism. So it's just all, again, in a tiny, tiny dose. And so it is just trying to get in touch with nature.
Tiny dose for a tiny, tiny person.
Tiny dose. And how about the fascinating thing where they say that they discovered ayahuasca with tobacco? That tobacco told them how to make this brew.
Yes, that's incredible. Yeah, the mapacho, the sacred tobacco. We just did a video about that on Double Blind's YouTube, and I appreciate you bringing up this idea of the pharmacopoeia of plants because that's also something that we try and illuminate for folks at Double Blind, right? Is that in the quote unquote West, the global North, there's a romanticization of these really profound psychedelics experiences like the master teacher plant, the ayahuasca, when actually, ayahuasca is just understood by indigenous communities that have used it for a long time as one plant among many, many, many plants that come from the territories that can be used to heal. And, when I was in the Amazon, it was not just you drink ayahuasca. It was like, I can't remember the names of all the different plants that they gave us, but there was a lot that happened, a lot of different beverages that they gave us before we even were allowed to sit in ceremony and drink that first cup of ayahuasca.
Yeah, and during the ceremony, they use mapacho and they blow it over you to try to clear the less healthy energies. And they use the agua de Florida, this liquid that they believe has powers, and they'll spit it in your direction.
The Shipibo shower.
Yeah, a little bit shocking the first time you do it. You're in this altered space, and then someone comes up to you and spits like this liquid around you.
I know.
It's definitely shocking, but it just speaks to the profundity of these things and how there is giant, infrastructure among the Shipibo and a lot of these other tribes. It's just fascinating. So, just the depth of that. I mean, back to the being an arts reporter, you can sit there and you can watch, a ballet or look at a piece of art and sort of say, oh, that's cool and that's big. But there's so much that goes into it. There's such a culture around it. And so I think the more that users and reporters and regulators know the giant history and the ways that these things are intricate, the ways they're multifaceted, and the way the history plays into it, the way it holds these cultures together, I think the more that these things can be the sort of beautiful big things that we see in arts or sports or music, they can be as big and as big a part of the culture as those things.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that up. It's kind of the perfect transition to getting into talking about some of your reporting, because at the risk of stating the obvious, the institutions that be, and I'm going to say that what follows under that umbrella in this current society is government institutions, academic institutions, sort of places that are deemed sort of credible in terms of sort of, what do I say? Places that are deemed as sources of sort of objective knowledge within our culture, like the CDC releases a report, right? and everyone just like takes that data and assumes that it's rigorous and assumes it's accurate, looks for a very particular type of wisdom and a very particular type of sort of investigation to legitimize something, right? And that's basically, science, basically Western medicine. And that does really complicate things because, as we know, these medicines, these drugs that are now being put through the FDA approval process, if they're not like any other drug or medicine that, it was just first synthesized by, a pharmaceutical company, and, they come from these biocultural frameworks. And there isn't a way in a double-blind randomized clinical trial to account for the mapacho, the maloca, the spirits, the territories, like all these different sort of technologies that the stewards of these medicines believe are integral to the healing. So what do we do with that? How do we try and force something through a drug development process when it really that's not where it comes from?
Totally. Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot. You're trying to take this round peg and stick it in a square hole because Western medicine is all about reducing it to one variable. And so like you said, you put the drug in somebody and you see if it works. And MAPS in their clinical trials for MDMA assisted psychotherapy for PTSD, they added a second thing. It wasn't just the drug, it was the drug with the therapy. But if you look at how these things have been used across cultures, it is so many different facets. It's the music, the mapacho, the nature. And that's true even when you're dealing with like the Western way of doing these things, where you did it at a Grateful Dead show and you had your friends there and you had the music, you had the environment. You go somewhere like Red Rocks around here, you have the rocks right there. And that's all part of the experience. And so now we're trying to take these things that have these very complicated ways of being used with all kinds of different sets and settings, and we're trying to fit them down into one very particular thing. And then now we're trying to move them into the regulatory structure of a place like Colorado or Oregon, where we are building these healing centers, and you're trying to, and building these laws around them, and you're trying to fit these complicated things into a structure that people can understand, a place with doctors and lawyers and marketing and licenses and insurance and all of these things. And so how do you make these things work? And that's some of the things that I've been really reporting on a lot, is that intersection of these old ways of doing things fitting into this thing that we know and that most people operate in, this straight world. And there's bumps in the road, which is one of the things we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, I look forward to getting into it. But first, we're going to take a quick break. So for those of you who don't know, Double Blind began as a print magazine, and it's still at the heart of what we do. I spent my whole career as a journalist before starting Double Blind, reporting on psychedelics, cannabis, and drug policy more broadly for Rolling Stone, Vice, LA Weekly, Quartz. I did just about everything in journalism. I worked at CBS News covering breaking news, a major newspaper, small media startups, and if you haven't heard, journalism is in crisis. But we started Double Blind anyway because we believe in the value of good journalism to educate and hold stakeholders accountable. We saw what happened in cannabis. Pioneers who put their lives on the line to get patients access to the medicine they needed, getting left behind because they didn't have the capital to compete in the newly regulated market. We've seen what's happened in mental health care and healthcare more broadly, whereby millions of people are suffering, don't trust their doctors, can't afford proper care, and just don't know what to do to get well. In our print magazine, we feature essays, investigations, photojournalism, and and much more by world-class journalists who are going everywhere from the ayahuasca tourism industry in Peru to laboratories at leading universities. We're supporting people like you on their journey with psychedelics, and we're covering this movement as it unfolds. This is all made possible by our members who, in exchange for their support, get direct access to psychedelic experts to help them on their journeys of healing and growth, workshops, and a subscription to our beautiful print magazine. Subscribe today at doubleblindmag.com/membership. So first up, I want to talk about a story that you reported for our newest issue of the print magazine. Basically, you looked into what Biden and Trump did and did not do in regards to psychedelics in the last 4 years and what this upcoming presidential election could mean for psychedelic reform. I think that this is a really interesting story to me because we hear a lot about reform that's happening on the city level with decriminalization initiatives and also on the state level in Oregon, Colorado, and other states that might want to follow. But we don't hear a lot about what's happening with psychedelics in Washington, so to speak. So what did you learn in reporting this story?
I think that the movement on psychedelics does tend to stay at the states and the local level. We've seen now 20 states, cities, and municipalities decriminalize or legalize psychedelics. And that affects something like 10 million people that live in these places where this stuff is going on. 10 million people is a lot of people, but we live in a country of more than 300 million people. And they are all affected by what happens at the federal level, where psychedelics remain in Schedule 1, and you're still eligible to go to prison for these things. So there's a tremendous amount of power that these people have and that Biden and Trump both had when they were president. Now, presidents over the last 50 years have mostly been antagonistic towards psychedelics. They have? They have. They have put people
I didn't know that.
Yeah, you may have noticed that. Some people went to jail.
I thought Nixon loved psychedelics.
He may have if he ever tried them, which I would have loved to have seen.
Yeah.
It would have been great during Watergate if he could have gotten himself a little centered and brought himself back to himself and find his North Star using a little bit of ayahuasca and some MDMA. But that didn't happen. We had Nixon, Reagan, Bush, Clinton with these serious anti-psychedelic agendas. And nothing shifted until like Obama and Biden and Trump, who have changed the federal government's attitude towards psychedelics. And it hasn't been so antagonistic. And so what Biden and Trump did for psychedelics was basically nothing. They didn't do much for psychedelics and they didn't do much against psychedelics. Both of them presided over the executive branch when all of these amazing pieces of progress were happening. Like under both of their watches, the FDA went ahead and allowed these clinical trials to go on with Johns Hopkins and NYU and MAPS and Compass. And the executive branch could have taken steps to stop that. And they didn't. And so that in some ways is a testament to the shift that we saw. Now, I can't find any instance where Biden or Trump ever even said the word psychedelics. And neither of them certainly has taken a psychedelic, if they're to be believed, and I certainly believe them. I
believe that.
Totally. We would live in a different world. But they say that they have never even touched a drop of alcohol. And I believe that too. They both come from alcoholic families where they saw the dangers of drugs. And so it's not surprising that they didn't ever do it. So yeah, in some ways, I think they're about the same in the way that they've handled psychedelics during their terms. The question is, will they be the same going forward? One of them is going to get elected in November unless something happens. And they are then going to be in charge of this big federal government that can let things go forward. And they could theoretically take action to move psychedelics to a different schedule. There's all kinds of things they could do. And whether or not they do them remains a mystery. There's some indication that Biden might be friendlier to psychedelics than Trump is.
Didn't his son have a transformative psychedelic experience?
Hunter had an addiction, and he used psychedelics to help him get off of it. And President Biden has not said anything about this, but President Biden's brother, Frank, said that President Biden is open to psychedelics. Yeah. So we'll see.
You gotta get Frank on the podcast.
Yeah, Frank. That's right. Maybe Frank will put a word in for
maybe
Ayahuasca.
He'll whisper a word in Joe's ear. So that's interesting. I mean, so one thing I want to say here, which the psychonauts who are listening might not want to hear me say, is that unfortunately, I don't think a lot of people are even thinking about psychedelics is the thing. So I was lucky to sit in a New York Times editorial meeting a couple years ago, and I was chatting with some of the journalists who were there and asking them about psychedelics. And the New York Times doesn't even have a full-time cannabis reporter right now. They don't have it in the budget. So they're not going to be focusing a lot on psychedelics anytime soon either. And I think when I was reporting for Rolling Stone, kind of a story that preceded your story that's going in this issue around what, is Biden going to, it was when Biden was first elected, what might he do around psychedelics? Like, you start talking to people who are really paying attention to, Biden's platform and what's going on in Washington. And like the general consensus is this just like isn't on people's radar. It's not important enough to people. Firstly, like if federal law enforcement was going to, it doesn't really make sense for them to be going after psychedelic folks right now unless they're being really loud about what they're doing because they still have an opioid crisis on their hands. So it's just not a good use of their resources. And then, you think about all the things that are on the president's agenda, right? Like wars and the climate crisis and the economic recession. And it's just like, it's just not important enough to people. And so then you start talking to people in Washington who are specifically trying to advocate for psychedelic reform. People like Melissa Lavasani, who started the Plant Medicine Coalition, I think it's called, and who was in charge of she headed up the initiative to decriminalize psychedelics in Washington, D.C., which passed. And she's going and she's talking to congressmen and she's trying to get this on the president's agenda. And, they have some ideas about how they can kind of move the needle. But yeah, there's just too much else that's going on is really the reality.
Right. There's too much else going on. If you ask people what's important to them in the election, it's economy. Yeah. That's what people are interested in. Right. And you look at the number of people that have tripped and you could fit them, into one little city somewhere. I mean, the number of people that have tripped, I don't know if it exceeds the population of a big state. And if they have tripped, it's not on their agenda to change any law about it. Because to them, it may not make any difference. Like, they did not get prosecuted, most of them. And so what do they care if the laws change or not? So a lot of the things that we're seeing where there is movement is when psychedelics have been tied to a larger problem, like addiction, and we're trying to address the opioid crisis, or problems within the military. The military is a big deal in Washington, and we have this epidemic. It is. $800 trillion, something like that.
Oh my God. Just take like 100,000th of that and put it towards psychedelic research. We'd have a whole lot less trauma and probably less war too.
Yeah, they just had this fight over getting $10 million out of the military budget for psychedelics. And if you think about how small $10 million is, it's just nothing. It's like the cost overrun on like a small, like plane. I mean, it's like the transportation budget of like one little base. I mean, I don't know what the good comparison is, but it's
Right.
almost nothing. And
Yeah, it's
there's just no
negligible.
votes here. There's no votes for Biden or Trump to gain by taking a stand on psychedelics. There's not an
Right.
appreciable vote
Right.
that's going to
Yeah.
win them any swing state or anything like that.
I know.
Yeah.
I know. And God forbid they should care about anything that, doesn't move the needle on the campaign trail. But I will say, the whole note on veterans is really important because a lot of people assume that psychedelics are like kind of a cause for the left. Especially because they associate psychedelics with like the first psychedelic renaissance in the United States, like 60s, 70s, Woodstock, Haight Ashbury, all of that stuff. But actually, because of the fact that the most robust research we have into psychedelics is the research looking at MDMA for post traumatic stress disorder. And post traumatic stress disorder is such a big problem in the veteran community. Psychedelics have become more of a bipartisan issue in Washington and in states. And we've seen some really surprising government officials come out in support of psychedelics, including the former governor of Texas, Rick Perry, has become a really big advocate for psychedelics to the point that he was one of the keynote speakers at the psychedelic conference in Denver, Psychedelic Science. And he was up on stage saying, basically, I never in a million years thought that I would be here, but here I am because I've heard these transformative stories. We also have Rebecca Mercer, who is from the famous or infamous family, depending on your perspective, that has been one of the primary sort of donors to Trump and other right campaigns, right candidates, who gave a massive amount of money to MAPS, the nonprofit, specifically for their research looking at MDMA for PTSD. And we have research for the first time moving through the VA, the Veterans Affairs for psychedelics. So I think it's really interesting, this veteran angle and this idea that psychedelics actually, we're living in such divided times, right? It feels like the echo chambers are growing, the ideological divisions are growing, and psychedelics might actually be an issue that can bring people in both parties together.
Totally. When you look at the people that are pushing psychedelics through Congress, there may be more conservatives that are doing it than liberals. I mean, there are liberals that are doing it. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is one of the big forces behind it.
No surprise there. She's definitely tripped.
She's definitely tripped.
She's definitely tripped.
Yeah, no question. And so you would think that that makes sense. But when you look at the people that are pushing it, like Dan Crenshaw is a Republican. He's big behind it. Jack Bergman from Michigan is big behind it. And Morgan Luttrell from near Houston is one of the main people that got this money into the Defense Act. So I think that's the most like money that's come in is this $10 million that Luttrell and some other people got into the defense funding bill, $10 million to help active duty veterans participate in clinical trials, which is a fascinating place for psychedelics to finally get one big chunk of psychedelic money is not in some like hippy dippy, let's get in touch with nature, not like let's heal eating disorders or autism or anything like that. It's veterans going down to Mexico and Costa Rica to help their PTSD and their depression, and then coming back here and saying, why is this legal down in Mexico and illegal up here? Like, if I'm fighting for freedom for my country, why do we not have these things?
Right.
And Morgan Luttrell is the most interesting guy because he went down to Mexico and used 5-MeO and ibogaine, which are incredibly powerful psychedelics.
Probably the most strong psychedelics that are known.
Super strong, and he's a super strong big guy, so he probably handled him well.
Don't make any assumptions. It's sometimes the big guys that are crying in fetal position.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. I was being a little flip there. Like, the big guys think they can handle it, and maybe they can't. But he came back and he said that it was an exorcism, that he had all these negative energies, and ibogaine really helped him work through that, which is just another mind-blowing thing. That you have this guy that comes from conservative Texas that fights for a lot of Christian conservative ideas, and now saying because of an exorcism that he had in Mexico, now we're going to change federal policy. It's just so astounding.
It's wild. And let's talk for a moment about the importance of federal funding for psychedelic research, because you get more into this in your story, which we'll put a link to in the show notes. But there's a lot of different ways that psychedelic reform can happen on the federal level, right? There's like the drug development through the FDA, which we've already kind of talked about and gets the most attention. There's also the potential, although we don't really see that happening, for some movement in terms of how the DEA regards these sort of people that are claiming they're psychedelic churches and whether or not they're going to go after them. And so there's a lot of different layers to this, but of all the different ways that psychedelic reform could happen in Washington, the main way that we see advocates really having a lot of hope and pushing for is that they want to see more federal funding for psychedelic science. Why
Totally.
is that?
I think because science is the language that we all speak. If we're in the West, we might not be able to hear these shipibos telling us that we need to listen to the plants, or hearing these legacy users talking about the ways that it put them in touch with nature or made them hear music in a more beautiful way. There's no federal funding, as far as I know, for the enhancement of audio experience and making people like the Grateful Dead and Fish and Alt J. Maybe that's going to come someday. But what the people can hear is that we are doing important research that is showing that psychedelics are effective for these very specific things. We've put them in these white coat laboratories with, sterile, like sort of a sterile environment. But with that, we've seen this positive outcomes. And so you can't necessarily, if you're a congressman, call for these things to be just out in the open, just flooding the streets. There seems to be no political will for that. But there is political will for it. Let's study these things so that we can know more. There's all these quotes about we need to figure these things out. And the people listening to this podcast will probably say, we've already figured them out. We know how they work. The Shipibo and the Bwiti and the Mazatecs figured it out, and people at Grateful Dead
Figured it out 2,000 years ago. We're a little behind.
Yes, totally. And it's totally the Western centricness that makes us not able to hear it. Then
Right.
We're just stuck in our own little bubbles. And the bubble in Washington says we need research, and so we can put it in a paper and we can have this data, and then maybe we can move forward.
Yeah. I also want to note that I did a story for our column with Double Blind's column with Rolling Stone on the first federal grant. I believe it was through NIDA.
Yep.
That gave money to researchers for psychedelic clinical trial. It was several $1 million that was given to Johns Hopkins University looking at psilocybin for nicotine dependence, and it happened in the last few years. Guys, I keep a lot of information in my brain, so I might not be getting all of this exactly right, but it's generally right.
Yes.
And what I learned reporting that story is that researchers in the United States have always heavily relied on federal funding to make their work happen because research is very, very expensive. And so this is something that has been a huge barrier in terms of moving psychedelic research ahead, is that researchers haven't been getting federal funding. They haven't been getting federal grants, unlike researchers in many other areas of Western medicine. And so basically, that's put the psychedelic community in a position whereby it all has to be privately funded. And so for many decades, we know that MAPS was kind of the pioneering research institution. They were started in the 80s by Rick Doblin. For most of their tenure, that's changed recently, separate conversation. They were a nonprofit, which means they were relying solely on donations from people who really believed in psychedelics. And then we had in the last 5 years this whole wave of for-profit companies. And again, separate conversation about the ethics of that. But even still, if you're a for-profit entity, you're going out to angel investors, you're going out to venture capital funds. I mean, it's a slog. It's a slog to get money, especially in an economic recession.
Yes. And there are no bigger barrels of money than in Washington, D.C.
Right.
And if you could just siphon off a tiny bit. I mean, also, if you look at where research has been for drugs for 40 years, it's been researching the downsides of them. I mean, NIDA is about drugs of abuse, and there was almost no research about drugs of benefit. And like even you said, the research that is being funded is about how to reduce nicotine dependence. Mm-hmm. And so if the FDA was going to go into a Maloka, they would see if there was a way to get ayahuasca to get them to put down the mapacho. And so that's, that's the hope. That's the shift, I think, is where can these drugs be used for good, and letting go of the idea that they're only bad.
Before we move on to talking about local reform, I do want to talk a little bit about Congress, because we've talked about the presidents, former presidents, probably one of them is a future president. But we haven't talked about some of the movement in Congress. And I know some of the folks you interviewed for the story said, actually, we should be focusing more on our representatives than whoever is in the executive branch.
1,000%. Like some of the psychonauts that I talked to have turned their attention to RFK Jr. because he has specifically said that he would legalize psychedelics in some form. RFK Jr., of course, this third-party candidate, stands very little chance of running, but gets a lot of love from the psychedelic community. And so people are turning to that as though he's going to make a difference. And he just isn't. I mean, he can't get elected. That's not going to happen. And also the president just can't change things. So if you want to pour your attention into something in 2024, it is these local Congress people that you can write a letter to. You can go to their events. You can probably meet them. A small donation probably makes a big deal. And so John Costa, one of the lobbyists that's trying to get psychedelics through Congress, he says that the Congress people are the champions that you need. Those are the people that you need to talk to. Ocasio-Cortez, Crenshaw, Bergman, Correa, Luttrell. That's the champions that you need. Those are the people that you need in your corner. And those are the people that could really change things and funnel those millions of dollars towards psychedelics.
So let's talk for a moment about what is going on where you are in Denver, Colorado. I know you've been following psychedelic reform there closely since probably before Denver even decriminalized psilocybin, became the first city to do that, which really was what set off this whole wave of decriminalization across the whole country. And this was a couple years before Colorado then went on in November of 2022 to legalize facilitated psilocybin sessions in the state. So there's a lot happening all at once. There's decrim on the local level, and then there's these psilocybin centers that are going to be opening on the state level. What's the general temperature in Colorado right now? How is everything unfolding?
The general temperature is that people are trying to see how this is going to go down. It's a very weird time. And there's a lot of excitement and a lot of anxiety, but also the temperature, the focus has changed from local people doing local things. And now it's moved into this government thing where the regulatory bodies of Colorado are in these meetings that are happening all the time to try to figure out what will these quote unquote healing centers look like. This is where people are going to take psilocybin with a trained sitter. And so people are just trying to follow that, and they're trying to get the laws into a place that they like. And everybody has a different opinion about what they like. Should it be more medical? Should it be more loose? And so these are happening right now. The Department of Regulatory Agencies is having these meetings, and they're really long and complicated, and it's all these different doctors and shamans and licensed people, and it's just a lot.
It's like if you've ever watched like a congressional hearing on like PBS, you know, and it's just like hours and hours and hours and hours, and you're like, what is, you know, we're just talking about shrooms, guys. Chill out. Like, why has this got to be so complicated? Just give the people shrooms.
It's so complicated. It's you try to read the legalese that they're coming from, and I'm a smart guy with a history major, and I've covered government forever. I can barely read these regulations.
Yeah.
Like there's these sub clauses where it's like, if you have this kind of a license, you need oversight from this kind of medical person, unless the person has like complications, like they have PTSD or they're schizophrenic or something like that, in which case you need to move them to this other kind of facilitator who's better trained.
Oh, really? They have a trauma-informed clause in there?
They definitely do.
That's actually a good thing. I'm glad about that.
Yeah, there's going to be 2 levels of facilitators. One that's just more for people that just want to like expand their consciousness or just... And then there's going to be another class of people who have mental health training that can really help people that either have PTSD or, like I said, risk factors. So if you've had bipolar or schizophrenia or something like that, you are going to want to go to one of these like higher level things. So they're trying to figure this out at the same time as they're trying to like include the indigenous perspective and like the legacy, so-called legacy market, which is just people at fish shows and camping trips and basement, mushroom circles.
Of which there's a lot in Colorado.
There's a ton. And those are really, honestly, the people that know how to use these things in a lot of ways. Like, if you're a medical professional, you run the risk of getting in trouble if you've used psychedelics during your medical career. And right. The NMHA is such a complicated like law. And it says there specifically, you have to take into account the indigenous perspective. You have to make room for that. So how do you do that? So it's a really interesting way where it's being a really interesting dance that they're doing, where they're trying to figure out how to fit, again, these round pegs and square holes. Colorado also has this super powerful personal use side to it, which is not in Oregon, which says that people can grow their own, use them with their friends, use them with their church, use them with their therapist. And so it's this question of like, what's actually going to take off here? And what's actually going to be the future? Because these regulated healing centers, it's going to cost at least $500 for a trip. It's hard to see how it gets lower than that, just because you have to pay rent and licenses and insurance and all these things. So there's a lot of tension right now. There's a lot of disenchantment. There's a lot of discussions. And so it's an interesting time to be here.
Yeah, I want to just go back a little bit in time, because I think a lot of people who are passionate about psychedelics and want to see reform, they just look at Oregon legalized supported psilocybin sessions, then Colorado followed. A lot of people think it's psilocybin therapy. It's actually not, because you don't have to be a therapist to get licensed by the state. That was intentional because they wanted more people to be able to get licensed to hold space. But a lot of people look at Oregon and Colorado and they go, these are successes. Like, psychedelics are being legalized the way cannabis was being legalized, and everything is moving in the right direction. And actually, if you're on the ground in Colorado and you're talking to different people who have been pushing for reform, advocating for reform, and people who, frankly, just liked working in the underground and don't want regulatory bodies involved in this, you see a very different picture. So we go back in time before the Natural Medicine Health Act, NMHA, as you referred to it, was passed. And there was a lot of controversy in the psychedelic community about whether we even wanted this bill to go through. As we saw with California and cannabis, a lot of people feel like Proposition 64 was a failure, the bill that legalized cannabis. And would we rather see psychedelics legalized or reformed in some way as soon as possible? Or do we want to see the right bills get through that are going to ensure accessibility, that are going to ensure inclusivity of indigenous perspectives, that are going to include decriminalization provisions so that people can use psychedelics at home without fear of being arrested? The Natural Medicine Health Act allows adults over the age of 21 to take psilocybin at a licensed facilitator in the state. And as you mentioned, it has this sort of like personal provision aspect as well. Initiative 61 was trying to go a lot further in terms of decriminalization. There were no possession limits, but it also did not include a regulated system for facilitated psychedelic sessions. So let's go back in time a little bit. Like, what is the NMHA do? What was Initiative 61 going to do that NMHA does not? And why were people kind of up in arms about this?
Yeah. Let's go even farther back. 2015 or so, the Psychedelic Club of Denver was meeting in this dingy little bar called the Monkey Bar in this hip, artsy area of Colorado, of Denver. So it was a very small thing. I mean, literally the meetings were 3 people. It was...
And you were one of them.
And I was one of them. And it was this space where people just came to talk about their trips. And then people would sit around at these meetings and say, why is cannabis legal and mushrooms are not? Because we legalized cannabis here in Colorado in 2012. So this wasn't too much after that. And one of the 3 people in those meetings wrote up a little law. And I say little because it was on 2 sheets of paper. It was super basic, and he just started shopping it around. This is Tyler Williams. And that got it going. Again, this is a testament to acting local, acting small.
That was the decrim bill?
And so it turned into 301. And
that would decriminalize psilocybin in Denver.
Decriminalize psilocybin. Okay. So after that passed, there was the big question of, okay, what next? Like, we have decrim now. What do we do a big thing? And so it was this real conflict between the people who just wanted decrim. They wanted the state out of their lives so they could do what they wanted to do. But then there was this other side, this other faction that said, no, we need a regulated market. David Bronner was a big force in the Natural Medicine Health Act. And because what he said was like, you're just not going to get that many people working in the underground. Like he said, our parents are not going to just take mushrooms with their friend. They are going to want the official people. They want people with training and experience and safety and licenses and all of this. So in 2020, 2021-ish, there were these 2 initiatives put forward. One, which was 61, and that was put forth by Travis Fluke and Nicole Forrester, who said, we just want the government out of our life, and we want to be allowed to hold healing circles as we've always held it, without interference. They couldn't get it off the ground because they couldn't get funding for signature gathering. It takes a lot of money to get signatures. And
yeah, a lot of money, a lot of time to even get something onto the ballot.
Totally. And so New Approach was able to fundraise to pay people to get these signatures. And so that was the one that ended up on the ballot. But there's still the residual resentment of a lot of old school people that say, you took this from us, and you made it into a thing that looks like Johns Hopkins and doesn't look like a Maloka or a raft trip or a camping ground or these churches. And so through that push and pull, they were able to create a bill that does try to create space for both of those things. And so we'll see how it plays out, but it was an interesting time to be there. And it's still, I mean, I was at an event yesterday at the CU Law School where we had this symposium on psychedelics. And it had all these radical students who are against the empire. They're wearing T-shirts that say "Compost the Empire." They want
I'm
psychedelics.
Sorry. It's not that I don't agree, but I just that's a lot.
I mean, they want psychedelics to dismantle the whole thing that we got going.
I don't disagree.
I mean, it's a real conflict because the empire does a lot of things that help us, But so the conflict even there between this researcher who is in the official world and he's designing new drugs. The trip without the trip was his specific thing that he was working on.
Oh yeah, the trip without the trip.
The trip without the trip.
Let's not talk about that right now. It's too much.
And he got so much blowback from these indigenous folks and these students who are saying you need to look at the root causes of our depression. You have to think system wide. The mental health infrastructure that we have right now is the cause of a lot of our problems.
Right.
And that's forced us SSRIs. And so we need to go back to our indigenous roots. And one other important thing I want to say about the indigenous folks around here, they keep saying, slow down, slow down, slow down. Take it into your body, take it into your community, sit with it, create a circle, see how it feels in your body when you move forward with these rules. And I think slowing down is what a lot of people want and are looking for. But that's not the world we live in. We live in a world of get it done, change things, make a law, make regulations. Yeah. And so the conflict between these two sides is just fascinating to watch. And the passion there is really, really, really hot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I can't remember who said this, but I was moderating a panel for Entheo Nation, and one of the panelists said, capitalism doesn't move at the speed of trust. And that is sort of the message that I also keep getting from, we have two different types of conversations that we hold for this podcast. One is with journalists like you, and another is with sort of experts and people that are working in the field. And, we have had a lot of folks on who basically are echoing the sentiment of slow down, bring it into your body. We can't dismantle the system from within the system.
Yeah, there was this professor from University of Colorado, Denver, who does a lot of research with BIPOC people. And he was saying, look, BIPOC people have been really harmed by the Western model, by Western medicine. And he was advocating to remove the influence of MAPS and Bronner and New Approach. And that actually landed really well with these students who tend to be more radical. Right. And we're seeing that in Massachusetts right now, where they're working on a possible bill that could be 2024. And there's this push and pull between do we want a regulated thing like Colorado, or do we want the personal use that we have in Colorado? Can you have these two things working side by side? I think Massachusetts is going to be a really interesting battleground in 2024 for psychedelic reform.
Yeah, absolutely. We just did a big story on that we can also put into the show notes about, which way do we go with reform. But you've mentioned New Approach a few times. And so I'd love to talk a little bit about this, because one of the big sort of debates or sort of things that was fueling the debate ahead of the Natural Health Medicine Act being passed is just sort of this sentiment among locals in Colorado that the Natural Health Medicine Act was not being funded or brought into the state by people who really understood the dynamics among people that had been working in psychedelics for a long time, and people who didn't necessarily have reverence for an indigenous cosmology or an indigenous way of relating to, frankly, what they think of as animate beings. And it's just this narrative of like, these big moneyed people are coming in from outside the state and they don't know what we need. Whereas Initiative 61, you mentioned Travis Fluck and Nicole Forrester. These are local Denverites who have been sort of in the muck of psychedelic reform and were also a part of the decrim bill. People just know them. Like, they're just known entities in the community. So talk a little bit about that. Who is New Approach? Why are people so upset about them?
New Approach is a PAC, Political Action Committee, based in Washington, D.C. They get a lot of funding. Sometimes their funding is a little opaque. You can't tell exactly who is donating to them, and you can't tell exactly why they're donating to these causes. I think the suspicion that people have is that the New Approach is going to create a model in Colorado and Oregon and Massachusetts that's going to be rigged, was the word that was used yesterday by this professor from UC Denver, in a way that will make it so that it's easy to do psychedelics if you have the money to get a license, if you know how to talk to lawyers and read laws. And so the suspicion among these radicals, and I don't want to call them radicals, they're often just people that love psychedelics and have used them for decades. The suspicion is that there's a hidden agenda. Mm-hmm. It's the dark money problem.
That hidden agenda is to make money on psychedelics and to prioritize profit over community-oriented models that center accessibility.
Exactly.
Right.
Again, there's this friction, and because you need money to gather signatures, you just can't get enough volunteers to do it. And so, I know some people in New Approach. I know David Bronner. David Bronner does a lot of very pro-social things for psychedelics. He donates a lot of money to a lot of people, including a lot of indigenous people, groups that are working to have sustainably sourced iboga from Gabon that gets the people of Gabon money to protect the indigenous sources of cactus and mushrooms. So I think from my reporting, I think the suspicion is somewhat overblown. I also understand that there's a lot of history of people being run over by the powers that be. So this is just going to be a thing going forward.
Yeah. I mean, so one of the things that I heard when I was trying to fact check a very complicated story that was aiming to understand what the heck the Natural Health Medicine Act even does, because as you mentioned, it's extremely convoluted and hard to read, whereas Initiative 61 was short and easy to understand, is that one of the things within the NHMA, I always mess up that NMHA, I always mess up that acronym. Anyway, basically what it's done is it has put a sort of moratorium on the number of healing centers that any one particular person or entity can own. So any one individual is not permitted to own more than 5, quote, natural healing centers. But some of the criticism among activists who really went into the weeds of this bill was the language is very vague, so this could be exploited somehow by big business that wants to come in and basically have like a healing center monopoly. And, given that we don't know how expensive it's going to be to get to open the brick and mortar, to get licensed by the state to serve psilocybin, to get facilitators in there, like all of these things are still open-ended questions. It's possible that, the person that's been working underground in Denver for however many decades, or Boulder or whatever, and serving hundreds of people, they're not going to have the capital to open a natural healing center.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a story for Double Blind years ago called The Upsides of Prohibition. And I interviewed these people that had been doing this for a while who say they're not going to go into the legal regulated market because there are all these really funky things once you go into the straight world. I will say that the NMHA is really it has a lot of provisions that could make Colorado different from Oregon. One of the really interesting ones is that you'll be able to integrate mushrooms into more of the infrastructure that's already there. So it'll be able to move. You won't have to do them, if I understand it right, in a particular healing center that is built for these things. You'll be able to do them in your doctor's office, your psychiatrist, your massage therapist's office. And so the idea is that you'll be able to go to the same people that you've always gone to, that you trust, and they can get licensed by the state to do it. So again, it's trying to figure out what makes sense, what's reasonable, and what can work. Again, trying to put these very strange drugs into the Western world.
And the other thing I want to mention about the Natural Health Act,
the act of health medicine that are natural,
that distinguishes it from Oregon, is that psilocybin services, according to the bill, must roll out by late 2024. But the measure could also be expanded to include facilitated sessions with ibogaine, mescaline, not derived from peyote, separate conversation about peyote, and natural DMT, such as the type contained within ayahuasca, by mid-2026. So we have never seen anything like this in the United States. And frankly, I'm especially interested in what would happen with mescaline and natural DMT. With ibogaine, even though ibogaine is not legal in the United States, there are clinical models for administering ibogaine because there are legal clinics in other parts of the world where people are going and doing ibogaine for primarily opioid dependence. But mescaline and natural DMT really are, I mean, there's been some small clinical trials, but really they're historically used in ceremonial contexts. So I have no idea how these substances get put into natural healing centers.
Totally. And I will look around these psychedelic gatherings and be like, does anybody know how to use ibogaine? And the answer is no. So where are we going to find these people that are going to know how to do it? It's just not going to be easy.
Yeah. It'll be really interesting to see how all of this rolls out in the year and also in the next few years, depending on what the state decides to do with these other substances, and if Massachusetts follows, and then what other states decide to follow after that. But all of these states are they're like laboratories, basically, for reform. And, hopefully what we're going to see, which some people tried to do in cannabis. We could argue about whether they succeeded, but hopefully we're going to see that, as these programs roll out in states, advocates are paying really close attention to what worked, what didn't work, and then the bills that are being introduced into state legislatures or being brought forth to voters at the ballot are going to be tweaked accordingly.
Totally. And it's one of the reasons that psychedelics are so interesting. It's not like cannabis where you just have to figure out how to build stores to sell it. Here you have to figure out how to build things that are close to, take these circles. It's all about these circles, right? Psychedelics have always been done in groups, by friends, community members, people who are going for the same thing, whether that's getting in touch with a higher power or working on themselves or whatever it is. It's just going to be a fascinating thing to see whether the state-regulated model allows these things to flourish and builds them up and creates spaces for them, or if it squashes them and turns it into something that maybe people weren't looking for. People like the old school people didn't want.
Stay tuned, everybody. We're going to be following it along closely at Double Blind. I know Reilly's going to be following it too. All right, well, now we're on to everyone's favorite part of the show, trip tips. I'm sorry if you've heard me say this before, but I just have to say it again. In case you didn't know, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a researcher, I'm not a psychiatrist, and neither is Reilly. We're journalists who also happen to like psychedelics. So we're riffing, we're having fun, but don't take our advice home, kids, or take it with a grain of salt. Anyway, Reilly, you want to pull a question from our community?
Yeah, I'd love to. So the question from the community is, my wife and I are struggling in our marriage, and we're thinking about trying MDMA together because we've heard that it can help. Do you think that it's a good step for us? And the answer, I think, depends on you. It depends on where you're at. But generally speaking, I've heard a lot of good things about it. One of the first people that I talked to about this was George Greer, who was doing...
He's an OG.
Total OG. He was researching MDMA back in the 80s, and he found that couples were really, really helped by doing MDMA together. And the same with Bruce Poulter and Marcella Otalora, who are two of the therapists on the MAPS trial of MDMA for PTSD. And I asked them years ago, after you work on PTSD, what's your next thing that you want to work on? And they said MDMA for couples. There's no better way to get in touch with yourself and your partner and to drop some of the defensiveness that people have when they're at a couples counseling session. Like, people, those can be really difficult times for people trying to work through the most sticky issues in their life. Questions of sex, of money, of taking care of children. People get really stuck on those things. And MDMA is definitely one of the things that can help people to, they say that it like puts a veil over your fear. It helps you to drop your defenses so you can look at yourself and your partner. There's been a lot of research about MDMA for couples, most of it positive, most of it saying that people really get in touch with each other. But it can go either way. Don't necessarily expect MDMA to make your relationship perfect. I know one couple who they were having a lot of trouble. They were struggling with their sex life, and they took the MDMA with the intention of trying to iron out those sexual problems. The husband in the relationship was really hoping that the MDMA would help their sex life. Specifically, he was hoping that they could open up the marriage. Very sticky topic that he didn't think he could broach when he was not on psychedelics. It's hard to have those kinds of questions. And a lot of marriages struggle with the sexual openness, not having sex, not having enough sex, people wanting more, wanting less, wanting to get freaky, wanting to not get freaky. So this couple took the MDMA together, and he found the courage to say, hey, I want to open up our marriage. Things aren't working that well. And she said, I don't want to open up our marriage. In fact, this marriage is not working. I want this marriage to be over. I don't want to live with you anymore. I want to move back by my family. And they got divorced because of this MDMA session. So I think definitely look at using it, thinking about using it, but also be aware that it might not turn out exactly how you want.
Right. So. Yeah. All really great trip tips. And I think what I would chime in and say is that it's important, at least from what I've heard interviewing folks who work with couples and work specifically around psychedelics and intimacy, to ask yourself and also ask your partner what the intention is for having this experience. Because sometimes you think the problem is interrelational, and actually it's just something you or they need to work on separately. Also, going into a psychedelic experience, any kind of psychedelic experience, wanting a certain outcome is kind of a no-no in the psychedelic therapy community. And that especially goes for wanting a particular outcome for another person. Like, that's not fair to them. So in the same way that you have to allow the psychedelic experience to unfold for yourself, and you never know how it's going to unfold. Like Reilly said, you want to go in and get more sexually intimate with your partner, and instead you realize, oh, actually, this relationship is over. You have to be willing to accept whatever comes forth for that other person. Maybe you're not the best person to hold space for your partner. Or maybe one of you wants to do a psychedelic, the other person just wants to be there to hold a hand. So there's a lot of different ways that this can look. And yes, there has been a lot of research looking at the promise of MDMA for couples and intimacy specifically. But it's always good to think about whether this is really the solution, quote unquote. This is really the next step, because there's so much that can happen before the psychedelic experience. And that really needs to happen. Meeting with a therapist together, journaling separately, talking to your friends, really getting clear on, have we done everything that we can to understand each other and what we're trying to get out of this experience before just throwing ourselves into this, taking the drug and hoping that it's going to fix everything. Because you might end up in a situation that you don't want to be in. You might end up in a situation that's wonderful. You also might end up in a situation that's not so wonderful. So that would be my totally non-professional, take it with a grain of salt advice on that one.
100%. Like my psychedelic psychotherapist says, we don't do agenda in here. Like, we're not coming in here to fix you. We're change things, move your life in a certain direction. We're just here to see what's here. And that is a huge problem with marriage, where people don't look at the actual problems, many of which are with you. And so you have to be willing to look at yourself and slow down and say, okay, where am I in my relationship with myself? Because that's often the problem in relationships. People aren't in love with themselves. People aren't taking care of themselves. So, yeah, being open, being non-judgmental, you can't control these things. And attempts to control them are just not going to work. Often the drug won't go for it. You won't go for it. Your partner's not going to go for it.
The drug will not go for it. Trust me on this one. The tighter you cling, the more it's going to push back.
Yeah.
I've learned that one the hard way again and again. I've learned that one the hard way.
So. Totally. Yeah.
Speaking of kind of coming into our bodies and our breath and coming out of our minds a little bit, which is sort of my go-to strategy for surrendering in the psychedelic experience. I'd love to invite you, Reilly, to close this chapter with a couple minutes of meditation.
Love it. Totally. Let's do it.
Hello and welcome. I'm Sky Weaver, resident facilitator at Double Blind, and I invite you into a little bit of breath work here today. So the breath we're going to use is coming in through the nose and out through the mouth. So we're going to inhale through the nose, a little extra inhale here, and exhale nice and long through the mouth. That's it. Again, inhale through the nose, a little gasp, and exhale through the mouth. Right, and on that exhale, just letting everything out. A couple more times. Inhale through the nose, exhale. Good, one more time. Beautiful, and you can continue doing that as I explain just a little bit about this, that this is a beautiful breath practice that you can do to calm your nervous system. Anytime I'm feeling anxious about anything, in fact, preparing for this video today, I did my breath work. So inhaling in, one more time, and exhale. Soften that jaw and that tongue, one more. Nice, and just allowing the breath to return back to normal. Wiggling the body a little bit. I'm a big fan of wiggling. And welcome back. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, Shelby.
Is there anything else you'd like to share for now? Anything that's alive for you? And again, I know that you'll be writing for us and we'll hopefully have you back, but just anything else you'd like to share? And if not, where can folks find you and follow along with your reporting?
The best place is Twitter at Reilly Capps, ReillyCapps. And there I have a link in my bio to my personal page where you can read all my previous writing. So that's it. Those are the main things. Yeah, I think so.
All right. That's all for now, folks, then. Thanks again, Reilly, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Shelby.
That was such a great conversation, and there's just so much more to say. As Reilly mentioned, 20 jurisdictions have decriminalized or legalized psychedelics in some form at this point, and reform is really unfolding differently in all of these places, and they're all just testing grounds to see what's going to work, what's not going to work. One of the things that I love so much about talking to Reilly is the fact that he is on the ground in Denver. And as mentioned, he's literally been going to gatherings of people talking about the prospect of changing the laws around psychedelics in Colorado since decriminalization was just a little seedling of an idea. So he knows all the players, he knows all of the dynamics, and it's so different from what we see in the headlines, right? Which is just like, Denver decriminalizes psilocybin, but we don't hear what were all the debates that came before that, and what is all the controversy that's unfolding now as they actually try and figure out what these things are going to look like. It's very, very complicated. So really just grateful to people like Reilly who are in the muck of it and who are writing for Double Blind, and we definitely look forward to having him back again. I want to remind everybody that if you want the chance for us to answer your questions about tripping, then you can email us at magichour@doubleblindmag.com, or you can go to doubleblindmag.com/magic hour. And either way, we have so many articles about psychedelics and about what's happening in the psychedelic movement. We have classes and workshops on microdosing and how to grow mushrooms, and we have a community, and of course we have our baby, which is the print magazine that comes out twice a year that you can subscribe to at the link in the show notes. So there's a lot of different ways that you can learn about psychedelics. You can become a part of Double Blind, and we welcome you, welcome you, welcome you. Also, if you have any thoughts about what we talked about today, or you want to suggest who should come on in the future, you can email us at magichour@doubleblindmag.com. We're also at doubleblindmag on all the platforms: Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, you name it. I also want to give a shout out to the amazing folks at Human Content who are producing this podcast and helping make it possible. If you love podcasts, then you can check out all the other amazing things they do on Instagram and TikTok at Human Content Pods. I want to thank you so much to all of the listeners who are leaving feedback and reviews. That really helps get this podcast out into the world as far as possible. So if you feel called, we invite you to leave some feedback, leave a review, subscribe and comment on your favorite podcasting app or on YouTube. We might even give you a shout out if you do that. We have full episodes up every week on YouTube at Double Blind. Thanks again for listening. I'm Shelby Hartman. Special thanks again to our correspondent and journalist, Reilly Capps. Our executive producers are Aaron Corney, Rob Goldman, and Shanti Brooke, as well as Alex Field, who also edits this show. Our engineer is Jason Cortizo. Our music is by Oma. To learn about our Double Blind Magic Hour program, disclaimer and ethics policy, and submission, verification, and licensing terms, you can go to doubleblindmag.com/magic-hour or reach us at magichour@doubleblindmag.com with any questions, concerns, or inspirational quotes. Double Blind Magic Hour is a human content and double blind production. Now let's take you out on Caminare by Abuela Malinali.
Caminaré en belleza, caminaré en paz, caminaré en belleza, caminaré en paz. Todo es mi familia, familia, todo es mi familia. Todo es sagrado, plantas y animales, todo es sagrado, montaña, selva y mares, todo es mi familia, familia, todo es mi familia. Heya, 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 ha. Heya, 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 ha. Todo es mi familia, familia, todo es mi familia. Caminaré en belleza, caminaré en paz, caminaré en belleza.
Thanks for watching. And if you're thinking, gosh, I really need more Double Blind Magic Hour in my life, well, you can start listening now by clicking on that playlist button right over there. New episodes are out every Monday, so please subscribe and join us each week on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.